This video looks at one of the alternative situations to having a perfectly competitive market, which is a monopoly. There will be 2 tutorials on this topic. So here are the assumptions of perfect competition that we saw before. So there's many small sellers and buyers in the market, they all sell the same good, there's free entry and exit into the market, and everyone has perfect information. Monopoly is basically the exact opposite of perfect competition in that it only has one seller, and that's the defining characteristic of a monopoly. So there's only one firm in the market. If anyone wants to buy the good, they have to buy it from that one firm. There are no close substitutes for the good that that one firm sells. There are also barriers to entry in the market, and that's why there's only one firm. There are reasons in place that prevent anyone else from entering the market. So we'll talk about what those barriers might be in a minute. And everyone still has perfect information, so in particular in this case, the monopolist knows exactly what the demand curve for the good looks like. There are actually not a lot of pure monopolies out there, but there are a lot of situations that are very close to monopoly. So examples include De Beers, which used to have a near monopoly in the diamond market, although it doesn't anymore. EPCOR, which has a monopoly on the provision of treated water and wastewater treatment in the city of Edmonton. There are some similar substitutes to that, like buying bottled water, but there's no perfect substitutes. Via Rail has a monopoly on passenger rail transport in Canada. Some drug companies have monopolies if there's only one drug that can be used to treat a particular disease, and so on. So there are several kinds of barriers that can prevent firms from moving into a particular market. One of them is economic barriers. So for example, if there are high fixed costs in a particular industry, new competitors will find it very hard to enter the industry because they can't enter at a small scale. They won't be able to generate enough revenue to pay for their fixed costs, which means they have to enter at a large scale. That's very expensive and very risky. You're investing a lot of capital into a venture that may or may not pay off. That's also related to economies of scale. So the minimum efficient scale in an industry might be high enough that a company operating at that scale will already dominate most of the market. So they'll already be able to provide all of the demand that there is for that good. Any firms trying to enter the market will then have higher long-run average costs than the existing firm. That means they won't be able to compete with the low prices that could be charged by the existing firm, and they'll find it difficult to gain any market share. There could also be legal barriers to entering the market. So for example, rules about intellectual property allow companies to hold a patent on a particular technology. So no other company is allowed to use the technology until the patent expires. So this, for example, is what gives drug companies monopolies on particular drugs. Copyrights give the creators of creative works like books and paintings a monopoly over their use. Trademarks give companies a monopoly over their particular brand. And then there's also franchises or concessions, which can be used to prevent competitors from operating in a particular place. So for example, the Level is the only coffee shop that's allowed to operate on King's campus. Sometimes governments will also do this with particular services. So for example, EPCOR is the only company that's allowed to provide wastewater treatment in Edmonton. And then companies can also use deliberate barriers to give themselves a monopoly or to protect their monopoly. So for example, they might sign a deal with a supplier that the supplier will only supply an essential input to them and not to any of their competitors. They could also sign a deal with a retailer only to sell their product and no one else's. So these are called exclusionary practices. Companies can also use predatory pricing, which is where they temporarily lower their prices to a level that their competitors can't match and drive them out of business. And Walmart has been shown to be one example of a company that practices this. And then companies can also make legal threats, such as threatening to launch lawsuits against smaller companies to intimidate them into staying out of the market. So the economic model of monopoly is similar to the model of perfect competition in that it assumes that monopolists act only to maximize their profits. But the situation that monopolists face is different than the situation that perfectly competitive firms face. So remember that perfectly competitive firms face a perfectly flat demand curve. They can sell as much as they want at the market price, but they can't sell anything if they charge a price above the market price. The market price itself is out of their control. But because monopolists are the only firm in the market, they actually face the whole downward sloping demand curve. So they supply the product to everybody. They get to decide for themselves what the market price is going to be. And their challenge is to choose a price that will allow them to make the most profit. So you might think that this would mean that they would charge as high a price as possible, but because the demand curve slopes downwards, the higher the price, the less of their product people will demand. So each individual unit makes them more revenue, but they sell less units. So monopolists need to balance those two factors when they set their price. So they can do this by calculating their marginal revenue. So remember that marginal revenue is the revenue you get from selling one more unit of a product. So for a perfectly competitive firm, marginal revenue is always just the market price. But for a monopolist, changing the market price also changes the quantity that you sell. So to calculate marginal revenue for a monopolist, you first have to calculate total revenue for a given market price. So that's determined by how much is actually demanded at that price. So in this example, if you set your price at $44 a unit, you can only sell 1 unit of output. If you lower your price to $40, you can sell 2 units, and so on. So to get total revenue, you multiply the price times the quantity that you can sell at that price. Then you find marginal revenue by calculating the change in total revenue as you sell 1 more unit. And that marginal revenue will reflect both the increase in quantity and the decrease in price necessary to sell that additional unit. So that means that the marginal revenue curve for a monopolist is always going to be steeper than the demand curve. The demand curve shows how many units you can sell at a particular price, but the marginal revenue curve reflects the fact that to sell 1 more unit, you have to drop the price not only for that unit, but also for all the other units before it. And that's because you can only charge 1 price for your product. So the greater the quantity, the further the marginal revenue curve is going to be below the demand curve, because you're dropping the price on more and more units in order to sell 1 more unit. So the rule for maximizing profit for a monopolist is the same as in perfect competition. You produce just up to the point where marginal costs are equal to marginal revenue, and then you stop. And the logic is the same as for perfect competition. So for every unit below that point, marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, so you're making a positive profit on each of those units. After that point, it costs more to produce 1 unit than you get in additional revenue, so it's not worth it to continue producing past that point. Then you set your price at the level that will allow you to sell that quantity. So you don't set your price at marginal cost. You get the price that you can charge from the demand curve. You don't want to charge a price lower than the demand curve, because that would mean you're unnecessarily giving up some revenue that you could have earned. But if you charge a price higher than the demand curve, you won't be able to sell the quantity that you want to sell. So in this particular example, your profit maximizing quantity is 5 units, and then you set your price at $27, which is the price that gives you a demand of 5 units. Now, if this market was perfectly competitive, the marginal cost curve that you see here would also be the supply curve, because if you remember, a perfectly competitive firm's marginal cost curve is its supply curve. So in a competitive market, the price for this good would be $20 and the quantity sold would be 7 units. So we can see here that a monopolist is going to charge a higher price for its good and sell less units than would be sold in a perfectly competitive market. So that difference is illustrated in this diagram. So we learned about producer and consumer surplus last semester. So producer surplus is basically the same as profit. It's the difference between the revenue that the producer earns and their production costs. So consumer surplus is the benefit that consumers get when the market price is lower than the amount that they would have been willing to pay for the good, which is reflected in the demand curve. So in a perfectly competitive market, the market equilibrium would be at point C, production would be QE, and price would be PE. So consumer surplus would be the triangle above PE and below the demand curve. Producer surplus would be the area below PE and above the marginal cost curve. With the monopoly, the quantity sold is only QM and the price is PM. So consumers, in this case, get a lot less consumer surplus because they're paying a higher price and getting less of the product. Producers actually get more producer surplus because they get a higher price. Even though they're selling less of the product, that higher price offsets the loss in producer surplus from selling a smaller quantity. The economy as a whole loses out on this dark blue area. So that could have been producer and consumer surplus, Now it's nothing because those units of the good are not traded. So that means that overall welfare in this economy is lower than it would have been in a perfectly competitive market. So overall, monopolies tend to be what we call inefficient. So here's a summary of what this model tells us about the differences between perfectly competitive markets and monopolies. So compared to perfect competition, less output will be sold in a monopolistic market. The monopolist will charge a higher price than perfectly competitive firms would, which is obviously bad from the consumer's perspective. A monopoly also typically makes positive economic profits, unlike a competitive firm, which would make exactly zero economic profits at the long run equilibrium. And the reason why a monopolist makes positive economic profits is because no other firms can enter the market because of the barriers to entry, which if they were allowed to enter, then they would drive down the price and therefore drive down profits. That can't happen, so a monopolist will typically make positive profits. And as we saw in the last diagram, the market is inefficient because of the deadweight loss that results from the lower quantity sold. So in the next tutorial, we'll look at some policies that can be used to address these issues.